All right, we are back here on the podcast, getting ready to talk Jets training camp here, as they are the signature attraction of the NFL, it feels like. Joining me today, great friend of the podcast, the host of the Locked On Jets podcast. You can also catch some of his writing over at Gang Green Nation. John Butchko is back with us. John, welcome. How are you?
Mike, great to be with you.
Yeah, great to be with you, too. And honestly, if you could only imagine what we would have told our past selves last year, he said, we'll have this conversation 1 year from now. Aaron Rodgers will be the quarterback. They're going to be on Hard Knocks again. They're going to be in the mix of Super Bowl. What would you have said back then?
I probably would not have believed it. It certainly has been it was quite an off season. It was certainly quite a trip to get here, and it's kind of. I think that the best joke that I heard over the course of the off season is that in 2035 we can do this all over again when the Packers trade Jordan Love to the Jets.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to see. I'm sure the Packers would take that trade because, they probably get a Super Bowl out of that as well.
Right.
Yeah. So, obviously, camp is underway here. A lot of interesting stuff going on here. So, from what you've sent so far, what's the general vibe of Jet Camp?
Well, there's a lot of excitement. Obviously, I think whenever you make a trade like this, it just raises the expectation. It raises the excitement level in the fan base. And I think that's especially true of a team like the Jets, which has been down for so many years, the longest playoff drought in any of the four major sports leagues. Fans have been just desperate for a reason to get excited about this team. And I'll tell you, the typical Jets training camp the last decade plus or so has been fans trying to talk themselves into the team. This time of year, there's always optimism, there's always hope. And I'm not sure people necessarily believe the team was going to be good, though. I think it was one of those you're trying to say, all right, if this guy pans out okay, or that guy pans out okay, maybe we've got a shot here. I think for, like every Jets camp since almost 2009, outside of maybe 2016 when Ryan Fitzpatrick was the quarterback, you entered training camp and the number one storyline was, well, maybe this is the year the young quarterback finally develops and can lift this team to the next level. You don't have that this year. You have Aaron Rodgers. You have a future Hall of Fame quarterback. You have one of the greatest quarterbacks who ever played. And I think when you combine that with some of the parts of the team that worked well last year, like the defense, like Garrett Wilson, Rookie of the Year, the thing that held this team back last year more than anything was the quarterback. And you're upgrading from the Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, Mike White trio to one of the greats who've ever played the position. And I think it just raises expectations and it raises the excitement level. And this is, a Jets training camp that we have not seen in quite a while.
Yeah, that's for sure. Obviously, want to go to Aaron Rodgers here, and obviously he's the headliner here. Seems very excited to be here. Obviously, we saw his whole New York tour over the spring. He was going to all the sporting events. He was going to the Tony Awards. He's very acclimated to New York City at this point. So, how do you feel like he's integrating with the team? I feel like he's very bought in with the Jets.
Yeah, and look, part of this is it's the honeymoon period right now, and it seems like, especially those last couple of years in Green Bay, things have turned kind of toxic. It's one of those things that I think anybody can relate to it. It's like sometimes you're in a relationship that just lasts a little bit too long, and it just impacts everything around you. And then when you get a fresh start, it just renews you, and it makes everything feel new. And there's a lot. Rodgers seems really happy to be out of Green Bay. He looks really happy to be a member of the Jets. And there's also, the honeymoon period on the Jets side where you've gotten this amazing quarterback. You've gotten this guy who's, won all these MVPs, a guy who's going to be in Canton one day. I think that, you'll hear the typical boilerplate stuff about how he's bringing leadership, how he's raising everybody's level, how he's bringing a level of accountability that hasn't been there before. And I think to an extent that's probably true. I also think that, this time of year, it's kind of what you expect to hear. The real test will be, if the team hits a 2-3 game losing streak at some point in the fall, how will they respond? But for now, again, this is the time of year where there's nothing but optimism, there's nothing but hope, there's nothing but dreams. You would expect things to be good right now. You would expect the overall vibe of the team to be really positive, and it certainly is.
Yeah, it certainly is. I know everybody's going to compare the situation to the Favre situation. I think the two big differences are, number one, that Favre came here right before camp because they sort of played this out the last minute. He didn't really want to be here. So he wanted to go to Minnesota. This is sort of the intermediary stop. Aaron Rodgers picked the Jets. You could tell based on him going to all the OTAs, or something that he didn't do in Green Bay the last few years. He's really committed. I know they said they're not pressuring him for more than 1 year, but it certainly feels like he's going to be here at least 2 years.
Yeah, another key difference is people forget this. Favre actually retired in 2008, and nobody really knows what happened behind the scenes. But he was coming off a season in '07 where he was an MVP candidate. But before that 2007 season, he also really recommitted himself to conditioning himself because he was at an advanced age. It was right around the age Rodgers is right now. And when you get to your late 30s, things don't come as naturally. You need to put in the work in the offseason. And because Favre had retired, there was always that talk that maybe he wasn't really ready for the season. I'll throw one other difference at you. Favre came in, as you mentioned, in the middle of training camp and had to learn an entire new system on the fly. And there was a game early that season in 2008 where he threw a bunch of interceptions. It was a Monday night game in San Diego. I think it may have been week 3. And he said it was like he had no idea where the receivers were going. Whereas with Rodgers, First of all, you have the full offseason to get back. I mean, I know he got kind of a late start because the trade wasn't done until right before the draft, but he's had more time to prepare. This is not a couple weeks thing. Second is they're running the offense Aaron Rodgers wants to run. They got his favorite offensive coordinator to install the Aaron Rodgers friendly system. Rodgers knows the system like the back of his hand, so there's going to be less of a learning curve. And then there are also the additions at receiver, Alan Lazard or Randall Cobb, and you can, depending on your views on these receivers, and I actually don't think that either of these guys is that great, but there is something to be said for familiarity. There is something to be said for having receivers he's comfortable throwing to. And those are things Favre did not have in 2008.
Yeah, so sure. Let's go to the running back room here for Meg. Obviously, 2 things you want to look at here. Number 1, Breece Hall begins camp on the PUP list. By all accounts, it sounds like he's going to be ready for week 1, but obviously you're wondering here, what Breece Hall are you getting here when he comes back off the ACL?
And that's a great point. And you've seen it across the NFL, where even if a running back's physically ready to come back off a knee injury, sometimes it takes a year or two before they're really back to being themselves. And Saquon Barkley across town is a good example of that. And the other thing I'll say is I think even if Breece Hall is ready to go week 1, there's incentive for the Jets, I think, to keep him on a pitch count in the early part of the season because they want him to be fresh. They want him to be ready for November, December. They really missed him the second half of last season. I know it's dangerous to associate everything in the NFL around one player, but the fact of the matter is this team was 5-2 when Breece Hall played last year when he was in the lineup. Then he got injured. They finished 7-10. And I think if you watched those games, you saw how big of a difference he made. At the point he got injured, Breece Hall was the guy. He wasn't just the go-to guy on offense. He essentially became the Jets offense for that stretch mid-season when they had that 4-game winning streak. So while that may tell you they want to get him on the field and doing as much as possible, it also tells me that you want to make sure that you've got this guy for the stretch run this year because you did not have him for the stretch run last year, and the team did not finish strong.
Yeah, that's point number 1 here. Point number 2, given your point, I think you're right. They do want to try and be careful with Breece Hall early here. We've seen the rotation in camp with Michael Carter, Bam Knight, and the rookie Izzy Abanikanda here. But the Dalvin Cook rumors are floating out there still. Obviously, there's off-field concerns of him as well. But he's been sort of fanning the flames, a bunch of Jets accounts on. I guess we're calling it X now, even though it really should just be Twitter. But that's a whole other can of worms here. But do you think Dalvin Cook is in play for the Jets? I think he's just using them to get a higher price somewhere else.
You hear all different things. You hear some people say that they're in, some people say that they're out. My guess would be that, first of all, it'll take the right price. And this has become one of the cliche talking points among, the NFL analysts. Look at the running back market right now. I mean, I think it's very difficult to justify paying top dollar for a running back. So my guess is that the Jets would be in if Cook's price came down. I think another element to this is Miami's another rumored destination, division rival for the Jets, another team that could be a competitor in the AFC. So even if the Jets aren't super interested, there's still an incentive for the Jets to kind of float out the idea that they're intrigued by Cook because that could help drive the price up for Miami. And sometimes that's a strategy teams pursue. Is even if their interest is kind of lukewarm in a player, they want to make sure one of their rivals doesn't get him for a discount, so they kind of play up their interest. I think part of this will also tell you what the Jets think about that young running back room, where you had Michael Carter, who had a pretty solid rookie season and then really regressed year 2. Then you had Bam Knight, who played a couple really good games, late November, early December. It did not sustain it. And Izzy Abanikanda, who's got a lot of speed, who could potentially have some big playability. And You see it every year in the NFL. There's always like a young running back or two, maybe a day 3 pick, maybe an undrafted free agent, somebody who comes off the practice squad. There's always a back or two who comes out of nowhere and produces. And if the Jets think one of these young backs can do it, that might temper their interest in Dalvin Cook. But I do think there's a logic to signing Dalvin Cook. He may not be what he was in his prime, but I watched some of his film from last year. Looks like he still has some speed. Looks like he can still make people miss. He can still hit the big plays. So there's also the element of, maybe you don't want to depend on Dalvin Cook for a full season, but you could potentially piece this together. As I said, maybe you limit what Breece Hall has to do early in the season, and Cook kind of handles things in the early going. And then as the season drags on, you shift more and more of the responsibilities onto Hall, and you limit what Cook has to do. I think that could make sense for the Jets. I think that the other elements that I mentioned, though, will determine whether Dalvin Cook's a member of the Jets or whether he's on another team.
Yeah, that's for sure here. And the one guy I'm most excited for on the offense this year is Garrett Wilson, because obviously he wins the Rookie of the Year last year with really awful quarterback play most of the season here. Now he gets a quarterback who is one of the top 10 in the league at the bare minimum here, and he's gotten comparisons by Rodgers compared to Devontae Adams here. What do you think the ceiling is for Garrett Wilson this year?
Well, there's a difference between being a 1,000-yard to 1,100-yard receiver and being a 1,500-yard receiver. And the question is, can he get there? And, as bad as the quarterback play was for the Jets last year, I didn't think it impacted him all that much. I think there are receivers where that comes into play. I mean, I can think of all those seasons Larry Fitzgerald had in Arizona between Kurt Warner and Carson Palmer. Wilson started off last season. Week 2, he had a big game against the Browns, a couple touchdowns, over 100 yards, a game-winning touchdown catch from Joe Flacco. And then he kind of faded into the background. And part of it was the Jets had that stretch with Breece Hall, as I mentioned, where they kind of put the passing game on the back burner. They really leaned into Hall. Part of it was he faced a really tough group of corners, Jair Alexander, Patrick Surtain. Back-to-back weeks they played Denver and Green Bay. And I thought he kind of struggled with their physicality a little bit. So with Hall, part of the question is how quickly will he and Aaron Rodgers get up to speed? Because Rodgers, through his career, has tended to take some time to develop chemistry with a receiver. It hasn't always come immediately. That said, Garrett Wilson brings so much to the table. And I can't help but think, the NFL draft season. And we always obsess over these physical measurements. How tall is a guy? What does he weigh? Or you obsess over his combine numbers. What was his vertical leap? How fast did he run the 40? When really, the most important question we should be asking about receivers is, can they get open? How do they run routes effectively? Because those are the things that really make a receiver. Yeah, it helps to be fast. It helps to be big. But if you can't run routes effectively, if you can't get open, you're not going to be able to do anything. Garrett Wilson, he may be a little undersized for a receiver. I think he's fast. I think he's got great change of direction ability. The most important thing is he understands the finer points of playing receiver. He understands how to set up a defender. He understands how to run a crisp route. He understands how to find open space. And, as obsessed as we are over the measurables, and I think Garrett Wilson does have some, again, I think he's pretty fast. I think he's pretty agile. But the most important thing with Garrett Wilson is he understands how to play the receiver position. He understands how to get open. And that's the type of thing that I feel like makes his ceiling really high.
Yeah, that's for sure here. And obviously, one of the interesting things to watch here for the Jets, the offensive line. I mean, it feels unusual to have a team that's built a Super Bowl contender to really have camp outs for both tackle positions. Like, if you were to handicap it today, who do you think are the starters at left tackle and right tackle in week 1 if everyone's healthy?
So this is 2 questions. This is what do I think will happen and what do I hope will happen. Dwayne Brown is on the physically unable to perform list. But if you listen, this is kind of reading between the lines. If you listen to what the Jets coaching staff has to say, they love him. They love his professionalism. They love what he brought to the table last year. And look, I have to say, for a 37-year-old guy who was playing hurt, who was an emergency signing after Mekhi Becton got injured last summer, I don't think you could have asked for Dwayne Brown to give you more. But he's not the guy he used to be. He's not the perennial Pro Bowler he was in Seattle and in Houston. He's in decline. I would like to see Mekhi Becton get a shot to win the left tackle job. I don't know that that's necessarily in play. Then on the right side, you have potentially Becton versus Billy Turner, who was a signing the Jets made after the draft. Turner is a tackle Rodgers has vouched for in the past. I think Mekhi Becton is a really important player for this offense. I don't think that there's an offensive lineman who, if he plays to his potential, could do more to raise this line's ceiling in a positive direction. But it just seems like, and it seems for a couple of years, like there may be a disconnect between Becton and the coaching staff. Becton was actually pretty openly critical of the coaching staff in an interview not that long ago, where he kind of implied that they had responsibility in him getting re-injured last summer because he criticized them for moving him from left tackle to right tackle, and he talked about how that put stress on his lower body and maybe helped aggravate an injury. And for their part, there's just been these little signals that the Jets coaching staff, maybe hasn't been Becton's biggest fans. And there's nothing they say explicitly, but again, it's kind of a reading between the lines thing. So my hope is that Becton gets an opportunity to play because at the end of the day, as great as Dwayne Brown has been through his career, he is 38. Billy Turner was, I think, a good signing for when the Jets got him as kind of depth at tackle, but at this point of his career, he's a depth guy. Becton's a guy who has missed 2 full seasons. I don't think you can diminish that. But he's also not that long removed from being a top 11 pick and playing a pretty good rookie season. So I think Becton should be in the mix here at one of the 2 spots. I think he should be given a shot to win the left tackle job. Will he be? I don't know.
Yeah, that's for sure here. I think one thing that all Jet fans were happy about here, especially considering Joe Douglas not had the greatest record with these contract extensions, that the team got the Quinnen Williams deal done before camp. I think it's the 4-year deal he wanted, the big payday. He deserved it here. So how important for the Ops' locker room do you feel it was for Quinnen Williams to be signed to this deal before camp even began to avoid distraction?
I think it probably is a benefit. I think that these guys are professional. I think if Quinnen Williams had to play the year out on the franchise tag, he would have. And of course, there's always the element. People always say it. You want to show the guys in the locker room that if you play well, that will be rewarded. I have to say, I give the Jets credit here because this has been an ongoing. This goes back as long as Woody Johnson's been over, and that's back in the year 2000. And it started with Keyshawn Johnson. For whatever reason, with high-profile players, it's almost always been acrimonious to negotiate a new deal. And sometimes the deal's eventually gotten done. But it's always felt like it was more contentious than it needed to be. And sometimes the Jets trade the guy, and it ends up being a great move. Like that Keyshawn Johnson trade got them 2 first-round picks, and they hit on both picks. Jamal Adams, you do that trade again 10 times out of 10 because at the end of the day, the Jets got Garrett Wilson and Elijah Barrett-Tucker for Jamal Adams. It was a great trade. But it's always been contentious. And, yeah, there were a few issues this offseason. I mean, there were a few things Quinnen Williams did on social media to express his discontent. And, yeah, he skipped OTAs. But I don't think it ever got to a really bad place. I don't think the situation ever really got to a super negative destination. I think that this was actually done pretty quickly. I think the Jets, did not drag this out, and they paid a fair market price for Williams. So I think, this is the type of thing you want to see. The Jets in recent years, unfortunately, this seems to be changing, have not had many impact players. And the ones they've had, they've struggled to keep. It's nice to have a guy who plays at an all-pro level, so you're able to keep on your team for a market value contract.
Yeah, that's for sure here. And one thing you notice here, all the beat reporters are talking about practice here, and say something Robert Saleh's always wanted here. The depth on the defensive line pass rushing is incredible again. I mean, we hear basic reports every day about Carl Lawson looks more like his old self. Bryce Huff is blowing by tackles every day. How Jermaine Johnson looks a lot better year 2. Like, if this team's going to go anywhere this year on defense, I think the pass rush is the biggest key to that.
Yeah, and it's funny because in the fan base there's actually a lot of complaints about the way Saleh deploys these guys. He likes to rotate guys in and out to keep them fresh, and there's especially complaints that Quinnen Williams is not playing enough. He has a relatively low snap total for a player of his stature. But I look at this and I say, it's tough for me to complain about Quinnen Williams' usage with the season he had last year. And beyond that, the other thing I'll say is I just can't help but think back to the Rex Ryan days. And Rex was a great defensive coach. But there was one problem with his defenses, is that they always struggled to close games out. And I kind of like the philosophy that you're rotating guys in and out through the game, so that way your top pass rushers are fresh to close out games. And I think I know they had that one hiccup against Detroit where they gave up the long touchdown last year, but the Jets closed out games pretty well last year. And I think part of that may just be that their guys were fresh in the fourth quarter, that they weren't exhausted, and part of that's because they rotated guys in and out. And I think the more pass rushers you can collect, the better your defensive line is going to be, because guys don't get fatigued through the game. It's tough. When you have a 300-pound guy hitting you, play after play after play, those add up. So if you can reduce the wear and tear on these guys, it'll have an impact in the fourth quarter of games.
Absolutely here. I think apart from Rodgers, there may not be any player on the Jets who has more pressure on him this season than Sauce Gardner here. He obviously became a star after he wins Defensive Rookie of the Year last year. We see him all over the place in the offseason. He's on the cover of Sports Illustrated. There's a lot of buzz out, like, is he the best corner in the league? So on and so forth here. What are you expecting from year 2 out of Sauce?
Well, I think at corner, a good play kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because once you get a reputation of being a shutdown corner, other teams just don't look at you. These other teams throw the ball away from you. And I want to be careful with how I phrase this because I don't think Sauce Gardner is going to have a better career than Darrelle Revis. But there's no question that Sauce Gardner was a more effective player as a rookie than Revis was. And Gardner's already got the reputation of being a shutdown corner. Everybody talks about Revis's 2009 season, and it was one of the most dominant seasons the corner's ever had. That was year 3 for Revis. He actually led the league in passes defense that year. And it shows that even at that point, he did not have the reputation for being a shutdown corner. It was year 4 before teams finally, figured out what was going on and said, we got to throw the ball elsewhere. I think Sauce Gardner, he's at the point where everybody knows about him across the league. And I think that's just going to lead teams to not throw at him. And the other thing I'll say about Sauce is you see it all the time in the NFL. Maybe you haven't seen it with the Jets much in recent years, but stars get called. If it's a borderline play with a star, you're going to get those calls. And you'll see it this year with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. I mean, how many times did the Jets not get a borderline roughing the passer call on a hit on Zach Wilson? That's going to change this year with Aaron Rodgers. Well, Sauce Gardner, he's a physical corner. And I think that there are lots of calls that maybe would go against other lesser players that refs are going to let him play through. And, there was an old saying years and decades ago in baseball. It's a story, actually, where an umpire called a ball on a pitch that Ted Williams took right down the middle of the plate. And he was asked about it. He said, how could you call that a ball? And the umpire said, well, if Ted Williams did not swing at it, then it couldn't be a strike. And I feel like with the superstars in the NFL, like a Sauce Gardner, there's a perception among the officials that, if Sauce Gardner did this, it must not be a penalty because he's just that great. He's that good of a cover guy. And I think he's already at that level. He's already a superstar player. I'll say this. I've said this on my podcast in the past, and I'm very, very hesitant to go into superlatives on a player too early in his career. But based on what I saw last year, unless he gets injured or something else crazy happens, Sauce Gardner's on a Hall of Fame trajectory after 1 year. I've never said that about a Jets player after 1 year before, but that's how good Sauce Gardner can be.
Yeah, it's definitely a great point. And also, I agree with a great point about the Jets getting calls this year, because I remember last year one of the big complaints is that I think they're the only team in the league that didn't get a rough in the passer call against their quarterback, because I remember that's the way Mike White gets drilled in Buffalo wasn't a penalty. There is no shot that they go the entire year without Rodgers getting 4 or 5 of those called in his favor.
Yeah, it makes sense because, the NFL wants to keep its superstar quarterbacks in the game. They don't want their superstar quarterbacks to get hurt. So, of course, they get these calls. I understand why Jets fans were complaining, but, there's a remedy to that. Go get yourself an Aaron Rodgers and you'll start getting those calls.
Yeah, that's for sure here. Obviously, we're in training camp. A couple of things I'll keep an eye on here. What position battles are you watching right now in camp? Because obviously, besides the tackles.
I'd say on the offensive line, center. Really interesting dynamic. Connor McGovern, who's been a 3-year starter, really solid free agent signing back in 2020 by the Jets. And for whatever reason, it just didn't feel like the Jets valued him that much because they were ready to let him walk out the door once the offseason began. There were pretty much, McGovern has said, there were no talks of an extension before the start of free agency. And it even as we got into free agency, it did not seem like the Jets were super interested in keeping him. It's just McGovern's market, the bottom kind of fell out, and they got him back for, I think it was a cheap 1-year deal. It was around $1 million. And it was almost like the Jets said, well, I guess at that price we have to keep him, even though he's been a good player for them. But they drafted Joe Tippmann the second round of Wisconsin. And because McGovern's here, they've just left themselves in a really good spot because they have a really high upside center prospect in Tippmann, who's big, but also moves really well and is very powerful. He's very physical. He's got the tools to be a really good center. And he can come along slowly. If he goes out there and shows that he's the guy in training camp, that he's ready to play, he's going to start. But if he needs more time to work on some mechanical things, the Jets have that luxury of letting him work on the practice field because they still have McGovern this year. So I think if all things are equal, Tippmann would get the job. But the Jets are under no pressure to start this rookie center right off the bat if he's not ready.
Yeah, that's for sure here. In terms of some camp standouts here as well, obviously look for these guys who are under the radar, making some names of themselves. Like, who have you kept an eye on so far has caught your attention?
Well, so with the caveat that, we're less than 1 week in, there's been a lot of talk about Garrett Wilson. We talked about, can he take the next step this year? Who knows what the future holds? It's only been a couple camp practices. But if he does take that step, if he does become like one of those, 1,500-yard receivers, you can look back. You can definitely look back and say, we saw it from the first days of training camp. Another guy who seems to be turning some heads is a safety, Tony Adams, kind of a, under the radar pickup last year. His athletic testing was really good when he came out of college. And safety is an interesting spot for the Jets. They signed Adrian Amos, who's got a good reputation, but is also on the wrong side of 30. Jordan Whitehead, who's okay, not great. If you ask me, what do I think will happen? My guess is that Amos and Whitehead will be the starters, but it's not like either of those guys is so established and has such a track record that they're guaranteed to start if Tony Adams goes out there and shows that he belongs on the field. And again, we have a long way to go. Lots of training camp ahead of us. Got 4 preseason games to go, so these things can change very quickly. But those are the two guys who I think have generated the most buzz, at least as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I think one guy to keep my eye on is the undrafted receiver, Jason Brownlee. Apparently, they gave him a huge guarantee in undrafted free agency. Rodgers likes already. They traded Denzel Mims very quickly. It feels like they're opening a spot for a guy like him to win the job. I think he's a guy I'm watching, too.
Yeah, here's the challenge for somebody like him is unless Corey Davis goes, and it seems like Corey Davis is going to stay with the Jets, you already have 5 roster spots guaranteed at receiver because you got Garrett Wilson. They just signed Allen Lazard to a big contract. We assume Davis sticks around and he'll be there. You've got Mecole Hardman, who they brought in from Kansas City. You've got Randall Cobb, who's going to be there because he's one of Rodgers' favorite targets. So that's already 5 deep at receiver. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that practice squads are bigger than they used to be. So it could be a situation where somebody like that ends up on the practice squad. And then late, as we get into the season, if there's an injury, maybe that's a guy we see down the line. So definitely a guy to keep an eye on. I think, we'll see. There could be an open roster spot or two for guys who play specialties at the receiver position. But I do think it's a bit of a challenge. That said, because of the expanded practice squad spots, sometimes that's the type of guy you keep in the back of your mind, and they could end up making an appearance maybe after you have some injuries in maybe December or November.
Yes, for sure. And the last thing, obviously, we have to touch on the Hard Knocks thing because obviously they did not want to do it. The league basically forced them to be on Hard Knocks. We heard initially, this is going to be different. Hard Knocks to give you as much access. Then the other day, Robert Saleh comes out wearing the I Love Hard Knocks t-shirt. We heard people talk about you don't notice them there. I think it's fascinating to see how much they buy into it, considering they were initially so against it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I always make fun of NFL coaches for is being so secretive about everything. And I think NFL coaches have this mindset that like anything they can't control is a distraction. Look, you're in New York. You're dealing with the New York media. You just traded for one of the highest profile athletes on the planet. You're going to have to learn how to deal with distractions. I think that this is the type of thing that will be as much of a distraction as you let it be. But as a fan, I'm really excited. Like I would love just to be on Hard Knocks every year. The last time they were on Hard Knocks, it was really compelling. I love hearing. I think, and look, this is a league. It should be about the fans and giving fans access to a team like this. I mean, that's the reason the show exists. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think that I have many thoughts on the way coaches respond to things, and this is a good example of how I think coaches are just so paranoid about like anything that they perceive as a potential distraction, which essentially is anything they can't completely control. I think the Jets will be fine, and I'll put it this way: if the Jets don't have a good season, I don't think it's going to be because of Hard Knocks.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also putting on the record. I think you would agree with me here. I think Sauce Gardner is probably going to be the biggest breakout star from Hard Knocks. I think he's going to be the guy they love to go to.
Oh, I think so. He's really interesting guy. I completely agree with you on that, Mike.
All right, John, thanks for all the time. Really appreciate it. People want to start following your Jets content. How can they do that?
GanggreenNation.com or subscribe to Locked On Jets on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast.
All right, John, thanks for all the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mike. Look forward to doing it again sometime.